Wholesome Appalachia Episode 7, John Glenn. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is not Poison Appalachia, it's Wholesome Appalachia. Once a month, we'll take a walk on the brighter side of Appalachia, because there are a lot of good things in Appalachia. I'm just drawn to the darker side of things. So the third Friday of every month, we'll have a bonus Wholesome Appalachia episode. Today's episode is on John Glenn, an astronaut and senator from Ohio. I missed the Wholesome Appalachia episode last month because my mom was in the hospital and nursing home and all that, and I was just doing a lot of running around. So I do apologize for that, but at least now we're back on track. John Herschel Glenn, July 18, 1921, was an American Marine Corps aviator, astronaut, businessman, and politician. He was the third American in space and the first to orbit the Earth, circling it 3 times in 1962. Following his retirement from NASA, he served from 1974 to 1999 as a U.S. Senator from Ohio. In 1998, he flew into space again at the age of 77. He was born in Cambridge, Ohio, and moved to New Concord shortly after his birth. And yes, both Cambridge and New Concord, Ohio are part of Appalachia. The region is considered part of Central Appalachia, a political, cultural, and bioregional classification that includes southeastern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, most of West Virginia, and southwestern Virginia. But let's get back to John Glenn. John Glenn was born in Cambridge, Ohio. When Glenn was 2 years old, his family moved to New Concord, Ohio, where his father, John Herschel Glenn Sr., opened a plumbing business. His mother, Clara Sproat Glenn, was a school teacher and a graduate of Muskingum College. John Glenn Sr. was in the U.S. Army for service in the First World War. 2 weeks after his wedding, Glenn left for a year of overseas duty in France. Upon his return, Glenn worked his time as a railroad fireman and then apprenticed as a plumber in Zanesville, Ohio, until starting his own business in 1923. When the family moved to New Concord, the Glenns built a home located on State Route 40 on the west side of town. The house was larger than most for the time period, included extra rooms upstairs, which the family rented out to college students and other boarders. Glenn Jr. was only a toddler when he met Annie Castor, whom he would later marry. The two would not be able to recall a time when they didn't know each other. Annie was the daughter of Dr. Homer Castor, the town dentist. He and his wife Margaret were good friends with John and Clara Glenn. Due to his friendship, John Glenn Jr. and Annie Castor grew up together from infancy. John Glenn would always say his childhood was idyllic, a middle-class boy growing up during the 1920s and 30s in a small Midwestern town where people kept their doors unlocked and school-aged children were free to roam the town and its environs. As an only child until the age of 5, Glenn gained a sister in 1926, when his parents adopted a baby girl named Jean. The years Glenn spent in New Concord had a profound influence on his character and shaped the values he carried with him throughout his later careers. Glenn first flew in an airplane with his father when he was 8 years old. He became fascinated by flight and built model airplanes from balsa wood kits. Along with his adopted sister Jean, he attended New Concord Elementary School. He washed cars and sold rhubarb to earn money to buy a bicycle, after which he took a job delivering the Columbus Dispatch newspaper. He was a member of the Ohio Rangers, which is an organization similar to the Cub Scouts, but just for Ohio, I guess. His boyhood home in New Concord has been restored as a historical house museum and education center. The small-town atmosphere gave Glenn a sense of community and the firm belief that individuals' responsibility to that community. Patriotism also was a key ingredient in Glenn's childhood. His father would serve as a bugler during his years in the Army and continue to play the instrument in New Concord during celebrations marking patriotic holidays. As a young boy, John Glenn Jr. learned to play the trumpet and would join his father in the playing of echo taps on Memorial Day. The Great Depression also had a large impact on Glenn's childhood. The Glenn family plumbing business, like most businesses, struggled to survive during the severe economic hardships of the early 1930s. And living through these years, Glenn learned by necessity to appreciate the values of both frugality and hard work. High school further shaped Glenn's concepts of citizenship and patriotism. His high school civics teacher, Hartford Steele, brought history, politics, and government to life for Glenn and instilled in Glenn the idea that within a democracy, one person truly could make a difference. After graduating in 1939, Glenn entered Muskingum College, now Muskingum University, where he studied chemistry. He joined the Stag Club fraternity and played on the football team. Glenn earned a private pilot license and a physics course credit for free through the Civilian Pilot Training Program in 1941. He did not complete his senior year in residence or take a proficiency exam, both required by the school for its Bachelor of Science degree. When the United States entered World War II, Glenn quit college to enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps. He was not called to duty by the Army and enlisted as a U.S. Navy aviation cadet in March 1942. Glenn attended the University of Iowa in Iowa City for pre-flight training and made his first solo flight in military aircraft by Naval Air Station Olathe in Kansas, where he went for primary training. During advanced training at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi in Texas, he accepted an offer transfer to the U.S. Marine Corps. Having completed his flight training in March 1943, Glenn was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Glenn married Annie in a Presbyterian ceremony at College Drive Church in New Concord on April 6, 1943. They became the parents of John David Glenn and Carolyn Ann Glenn in the late 1940s. A talented musician, Annie played the trombone, piano, and pipe organ and graduated in 1942 from Muskingum College with a degree in music. Although hampered most of her life by a severe stuttering problem, Annie never let her disability impinge upon her independence. I'll talk about Annie off and on a lot because she was a huge influence on his life and they loved each other dearly until their deaths. For example, in March 1964, when John Glenn became bedridden due to an accident during his first run for the U.S. Senate, Annie undertook a full schedule of public appearances in an effort to keep his campaign active. She overcame her impediment in the late 1970s through extensive speech therapy and became a national spokesperson advocating programs for those with speech and hearing disabilities. As she has done throughout her whole life, Annie continued to be John Glenn's biggest supporter and most insightful critic. After the war, he was a member of the Marine Fighter Squadron 218 on the North China Patrol and served on Guam from June 1948 to December 1950. He served as an instructor in advanced flight training at Corpus Christi, Texas, and then attended amphibious warfare training at Quantico, Virginia. In Korea, he flew 63 missions with Marine Fighter Squadron 311. As an exchange pilot with the Air Force, Glenn flew 27 missions in the F-86 Sabre. In the last 9 days of fighting in Korea, Glenn shot down 3 MiGs in combat along the Yalu River. With combat experience as a fighter pilot, Glenn applied for training as a test pilot while still in Korea. He reported to the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School at NAS Patuxent River in Maryland in January 1954 and graduated in July. At Patuxent River, future Medal of Honor recipient James Stockdale tutored him in physics and math. Glenn's first flight test assignment testing his FJ-3 Fury nearly killed him when his cockpit depressurized and his oxygen system failed. He also tested the armament of aircraft such as the Vought F-7U Cutlass and the F-8U Crusader. From November 1956 to April 1959, he was assigned to the Fighter Design Branch of the Military Navy Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington, D.C., and attended the University of Maryland. In July 1957, while he was a project officer at the F-8U Crusader, he set a transcontinental speed record from Los Angeles to New York, 3 hours and 23 minutes. It was the first transcontinental flight to average supersonic speed. Disliking his Bureau of Aeronautics desk job, he devised the flight as both a way to keep flying and publicly demonstrate the F-8U Crusader. At the time, the transcontinental speed record held by Air Force Republic F-84 Thunderjet was 3 hours and 45 minutes, and Glenn calculated that the F-8U Crusader could do it faster. Because its 586 mile per hour airspeed was faster than that of a .45 caliber gun, Glenn called the flight Project Bullet. He flew an F-8 Crusader 2,445 miles from Los Alamitos, California to Floyd Bennett Field in New York City in 3 hours, 23 minutes, and 8.3 seconds. His onboard camera took the first continuous transcontinental panoramic photograph of the United States. He received his 5th Distinguished Flying Cross for the mission. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel on April 1st, 1959. Glenn now had nearly 9,000 hours of flying time, including about 3,000 hours in jets, but knew at the age of 36 he was now likely too old to continue to fly. So this leads us to NASA. But before we get there, I briefly want to talk about the space race. The space race was a 20th century competition between the Cold War rivals, the United States and the Soviet Union, to achieve superior spaceflight capability. It had its origins in the ballistic missile-based nuclear arms race between the two nations following World War II and the onset of the Cold War. The technological advantage demonstrated by spaceflight achievement was seen as necessary for national security, particularly in regard to intercontinental ballistic missile and satellite reconnaissance capability. but also became part of the cultural symbolism and ideology of the time. The competition began on July 30th, 1955, when the United States announced its intent to launch artificial satellites for the International Geophysical Year. 4 days later, the Soviet Union responded by declaring they would also launch a satellite in the near future. The launching of satellites was enabled by developments in ballistic missile capabilities since the end of World War II. The competition gained Western public attention with the Sputnik crisis when the USSR achieved the first successful satellite launch, Sputnik 1, on October 4th, 1957. It gained momentum when the USSR sent the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space in the orbital flight of Vostok 1 on April 12, 1961. These were followed by a string of other firsts achieved by Soviets over the next few years. Gagarin's flight led U.S. President John F. Kennedy to raise the stakes on May 25, 1961, by asking U.S. Congress to commit to the goal of landing man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. Both countries began developing super heavy lift launch vehicles, with the U.S. successfully deploying the Saturn V, which was large enough to send a 3-person orbiter or 2-person lander to the moon. Kennedy's moon landing goal was achieved in July 1969 with the flight of Apollo 11. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, launching in a ballistic trajectory on Mercury Redstone 3 in a spaceship named Freedom 7. Though he did not achieve orbit like Gagarin, he was the first person to exercise manual control over his spacecraft's altitude and retrorocket firing. After his successful return, Shepard was celebrated as a national hero, honored with parades in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles, and received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal from President John F. Kennedy. American Virgil Gus Grissom repeated Shepard's suborbital flight in Liberty Bell 7 on July 21, 1961. Almost a year after the Soviet Union put a human into orbit, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20, 1962. His Mercury Atlas 6 mission completed 3 orbits in the Friendship 7 spacecraft. He splashed down safely in Atlantic Ocean after a tense re-entry due to what falsely appeared from the telemetry data to be a loose heat shield. So let's get back to Glenn and his achievement. His Bureau of Aeronautics job gave Glenn access to new spaceflight news, such as the X-15 rocket plane. While on duty at Pawtuxet and in Washington, Glenn read everything he could about space. His office was asked to send a test pilot to Langley Air Force Base in Virginia to make runs on a spaceflight simulator as part of research by the newly formed NASA into re-entry vehicle shapes. The pilot would also be sent to the Naval Air Development Center in Johnsville, Pennsylvania, and would be subjected to high G-forces in a centrifuge for comparison with data collected in the simulator. His request for the position was granted, and he spent several days at Langley and a week in Johnsville for the testing. As one of the few pilots to have done such testing, Glenn had become an expert on the subject. NASA asked military service members to participate in planning the mock-up of a spacecraft. Having participated in the research at Langley and Johnsville, he was sent to the McDonnell plant in St. Louis as a service advisor to NASA's spacecraft mock-up board. Envisioning himself in the vehicle, Glenn stated that the passenger would have to be able to control the spacecraft. McDonnell engineers told him the importance of lightening the vehicle as much as possible, so Glenn began exercising to lose 30 pounds, by which he estimated he was overweight. Eisenhower directed NASA to recruit its first astronauts from military test pilots. Of 508 graduates of test pilot schools, 110 matched the minimum standards. Marine Corps pilots were mistakenly admitted at first. 2 were quickly found, including Glenn. The candidates had to be younger than 40, possess a bachelor's degree or equivalent, and be 5 feet 11 inches or less. Only the height requirement was strictly enforced, owing to the size of the Project Mercury spacecraft. This was fortunate for Glenn, who barely met the requirements, as he was near the age cutoff and lacked a science-based degree. But he had taken more classes since leaving college than needed for graduation. Glenn was otherwise so outstanding a candidate that Colonel Jake Dill, his commanding officer at the test pilot school, visited NASA headquarters to insist that Glenn would be the perfect astronaut. For an interview with Charles Donlin, associate director of the Project Mercury, Glenn brought the results from the centrifuge to show that he had done well on a test that perhaps no other candidate had taken. Donlin also noticed that Glenn stayed late at night to study the schematics of the Mercury spacecraft. He was among the 32 of the first 69 candidates that passed the first stop of the evaluation and were interested in continuing. On February 27th, a grueling series of physical and psychological tests began at the Loveless Clinic and the Wright Aerospace Medical Laboratory. Because of his Bureau of Aeronautics job, Glenn was already participating in Project Mercury while other candidates were at Wright. On March 17th, he and most of those who would choose the astronauts visited the McDonnell plant building the spacecraft to inspect its progress and make changes. While Glenn had not scored the highest on all the tests, a member of the selection committee recalled he had been most impressed out of everyone with his strength of personality and his dedication. On April 6th, Donlin called Glenn to offer him a position at Project Mercury, one of 7 candidates chosen as astronauts. Glenn was pleased while Andy was supportive but wary of the danger. During his 3 years at Pawtuxet, 12 test pilots had died. The identities of the 7 were announced at a press conference at Dolly Madison House in Washington, D.C. on April 9, 1959. Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, and Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton. In The Right Stuff, Tom Wolfe wrote that Glenn came out of its tops among 7 very fair-haired boys. He had the hottest record as a pilot. He was the most quotable, he was the most photogenic, and the lone Marine. Glenn remained an officer in the Marine Corps after his selection and was assigned to the NASA Space Task Group at Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. The task force moved to Houston, Texas in 1962 and became part of the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center. A portion of the astronauts' training was in the classroom where they learned space science. The group also received hands-on training, which included scuba diving and work in simulators. Astronauts secured an additional role in the spaceflight program to provide pilot input and design. The astronauts divided the various tasks between them. Glenn's specialization was cockpit layout design and control functioning for the Mercury and early Apollo programs. He pressed the other astronauts to set a moral example, living up to the squeaky clean image of them that had been portrayed by Life magazine, a position that was not popular with the other astronauts. One story I read said the 7 astronauts gathered at Cape Canaveral to watch their first rocket launch of an SM-65D Atlas, which was similar to the one that was to carry them into orbit. A few minutes after liftoff, it exploded spectacularly, lighting up the night sky. The astronauts were stunned. Shepard turned to Glenn and said, "Well, I'm glad they got that out of the way." After his selection as a Mercury astronaut, Glenn was assigned to the NASA Space Task Group at Langley, Virginia in April 1959. The Space Task Group was moved to Houston and became part of the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center, now Johnson Space Center in Houston, in 1962. Before his 4-hour, 55-minute flight in the Friendship 7 capsule, Glenn had served as a backup pilot for astronauts Alan Shepard, the first American in space, who flew on May 5, 1961, and to Virgil Gus Grissom, who followed Shepard on a suborbital flight of his own. Glenn was selected for the first orbital flight, Mercury Atlas 6, and on February 20th, 1962, his space capsule Friendship 7 was launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Its orbit ranged from approximately 161 to 261 kilometers, which is 100 to 162 kilometers in altitude. The flight went mostly according to plan, aside from a faulty thruster that forced Glenn to control Friendship 7 manually. A faulty switch on board had also relayed the inaccurate message to Mission Control that the heat shield had been released. He was told to not release the pack of retro rockets on the rear of the spacecraft after they had fired. Mission Control hoped that if the heat shield had been released, the straps of the retro rocket pack would hold the shield long enough for Glenn to survive re-entry. Glenn made 3 orbits, landing nearly 5 hours after launch in the Atlantic Ocean near Grand Turk Island in the Turks and Caicos Islands. He became a national hero. Glenn met President John F. Kennedy and received a ticker tape parade in New York reminiscent of those honoring Charles Lindbergh and other heroes. He became so valuable to the nation as an iconic figure, according to NASA Administrator Charles Bolden, that Kennedy would not risk putting him back in space again. Glenn's fame and political potential were noted by the Kennedys, and he became a friend of the Kennedy family. On February 23, 1962, President Kennedy gave him the NASA Distinguished Service Medal for his Friendship 7 flight. Upon receiving the award, Glenn said, "I would like to consider I was a figurehead for this whole big, tremendous effort, and I'm very proud of the medal I have on my lapel." Glenn also received his 6th Distinguished Flying Cross for his efforts. He was among the first group of astronauts to be awarded the Congressional Space Medal of Honor. The award was presented to him by President Jimmy Carter in 1978. After his 1962 spaceflight, NASA proposed giving Glenn the Medal of Honor, but Glenn did not think that would be appropriate. His military and space awards were stolen from him in 1978, and he remarked that he would keep this medal in a safe. At 42, Glenn was the oldest member of the astronaut corps and would likely be close to 50 by the time the lunar landings took place. During Glenn's training, NASA psychologists determined that he was the astronaut best suited for public life. He decided to run for the U.S. Senate as a senator from Ohio. To avoid partisanship, NASA quickly closed Glenn's agency office. The New York Times reported that while many Ohioans were skeptical of Glenn's qualifications for the Senate, he could defeat Young in the Democratic primary. Whether he could defeat Representative Robert Taft Jr., the likely Republican candidate in the general election, was much less clear. In late February, he was hospitalized for a concussion sustained in a fall against a bathtub while attempting to fix a mirror in a hotel. An inner ear injury from the accident left him unable to campaign. Both his wife and Scott Carpenter campaigned on his behalf during February and March, but doctors gave Glenn a recovery time of 1 year. Glenn did not want to win solely based on this because of his astronaut fame, so he dropped out of the race on March 30th. Glenn was still on leave from the Marine Corps, and he withdrew his papers to retire so he could keep a salary and health benefits. Glenn was on the list of potential candidates to be promoted to full colonel, but he notified the commandant of the Marine Corps of his intention to retire so another Marine could receive the promotion. President Johnson later decided to promote Glenn to full colonel status without taking someone else's spot. He retired as a colonel on January 1st, 1965. Glenn was approached by R.C. Cola to join their public relations department, but Glenn declined it because he wanted to be involved with the business and not just the face of it. The company revised their offer and offered Glenn a vice president of corporate development position and a place on the board of directors. The company later expanded Glenn's role, promoting him to president of the Royal Crown International. A Senate seat was opened in 1968, and Glenn was asked about his current political aspirations. He said he had no current plan, and let's talk about it one of these days. Glenn also said that a 1970 Senate run was a possibility. Glenn remained close to the Kennedy family and campaigned for Robert F. Kennedy during his 1968 presidential campaign. In 1968, Glenn was in the Kennedy's hotel suite when Kennedy heard he had won California. Glenn was supposed to go with him to celebrate, but decided not to, as there would be many people around there. Kennedy went downstairs to make his victory speech and was assassinated. Glenn and Annie went with Kennedy to the hospital, and the next morning took Kennedy's children home to Virginia. Glenn was later a pallbearer at the funeral in New York. In 1970, Young did not seek re-election, and the seat was open. Businessman Howard Metzenbaum, Young's former campaign manager, was backed by the Ohio Democratic Party and major labor unions, which provided him a significant funding advantage over Glenn. Glenn's campaign persuaded him to be thrifty during the primary so he could save money for the general election. By the end of the primary campaign, Metzenbaum was spending 4 times as much as Glenn. Glenn was defeated in the Democratic primary by Metzenbaum, who received 51% of the vote to Glenn's 49%. Some prominent Democrats said that Glenn was a hapless political rube, and one newspaper called him the ultimate square. Metzenbaum lost his general election to Robert Taft Jr. Glenn remained active in the political scene following his defeat. Governor John Gilligan appointed Glenn to be the chairman of the Citizens Task Force on Environmental Protection in 1970. The task force was created to survey environmental problems in the state and released a report in 1971 detailing the issues. The meetings and the final report of the task force were major contributors to the formation of Ohio's Environmental Protection Agency. Side note about Governor John Gilligan. I mentioned him on my alien invasion episode. He's someone who had seen something and announced at a press conference. So just wanted to add that in there in case that name sounded familiar. Glenn's campaign changed their strategy after the 1970 election. In 1970, Glenn won most of the counties in Ohio, but lost those with larger populations. The campaign changed its focus and worked primarily in the large counties. In the primary, Metzenbaum contrasted his strong business background with Glenn's military and astronaut credentials and said that his opponent had never held a payroll. Glenn's reply became known as the Gold Star Mother Speech. He told Metzenbaum to go to a veterans hospital and look those men with mangled bodies in the eye and tell them they didn't hold a job. You can go with me to any Gold Star mother and look her in the eye and tell her that her son did not hold a job. He defeated Metzenbaum 54 to 46% before defeating Ralph Perk, the Republican mayor of Cleveland, in the general election, beginning a Senate career which would continue until 1999. He was elected U.S. Senator from the state in 1974 and was re-elected 3 times thereafter. Glenn was unsuccessful, however, in the bid to become the 1984 Democratic presidential candidate. During his time in the Senate, Glenn focused on nuclear proliferation, wasteful government spending, and aging. On February 20th, 1997, which was the 35th anniversary of his Friendship 7 flight, Glenn announced that his retirement from the U.S. Senate would occur at the end of his term in January 1999. Glenn retired because of his age, noting that he would have been 83 at the end of another term, and quipping that there's still no cure for the common birthday. On January 16, 1998, NASA Administrator Don Golden announced that Glenn would be part of the STS-95 crew. This made him, at age 77, the oldest person to fly in space at the time. NASA and the National Institute of Aging plan to use Glenn as a test subject for research with biometrics taken before, during, and after his flight. Some experiments in circadian rhythms, for example, compared him with younger crew members. In addition to these tests, he was in charge of the flight's photography and videography. Glenn returned to space on the Space Shuttle on October 29, 1998, as a payload specialist on Space Shuttle Discovery. Shortly before the flight, researchers disqualified Glenn from one of the flight's 2 major human experiments on the effect of melatonin for undisclosed medical reasons. He participated in experiments on sleep monitoring and protein use, though. Glenn was an ordained elder of the Presbyterian Church. His religious faith began before he became an astronaut and was reinforced after he traveled into space. To look out at this kind of creation and not believe in God, to me, is impossible, said Glenn after his second and final space voyage. He saw no contradiction between belief in God and knowledge that evolution is a fact, and believed evolution should be taught in schools. I don't see that I'm any less religious, that I can appreciate the fact that science just records that we change with evolution and time, and that's a fact. It doesn't mean it's less wondrous, and it doesn't mean that there can't be some power greater than us that has been behind and is behind whatever is going on. Glenn was in good health for most of his life. He retained a private pilot's license until 2011, when he was 90. In June 2014, Glenn underwent successful heart valve replacement surgery at the Cleveland Clinic. In December 2016, he was hospitalized at the James Cancer Center of Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center in Columbus. According to family source, Glenn had been in declining health and his condition was grave. His wife and their children and grandchildren were at the hospital. Glenn died on December 8, 2016 at the Wexner Medical Center. He was 95 years old. No cause of death was disclosed. After his death, his body lay in state at the Ohio State House. There was a memorial service at Mershon Auditorium at Ohio State University. Another memorial service was performed at the Kennedy Space Center near the Heroes and Legends building. His body was interred at Arlington National Cemetery on April 6, 2017. At the time of his death, Glenn was the last surviving member of the Mercury 7. The phrase "Godspeed, John Glenn," which fellow Mercury astronaut Scott Carpenter had used to hail Glenn's launch into space, became a social media hashtag. President Obama ordered flags to be flown at half-staff until Glenn's burial. On April 5, 2017, President Donald Trump issued Presidential Proclamation 9588 titled Honoring the Memory of John Glenn. President Barack Obama said, "With John's passing, our nation has lost an icon, and Michelle and I have lost a friend. John spent his life breaking barriers, from defending our freedom as a decorated Marine Corps fighter pilot in World War II in Korea to setting a transcontinental speed record to becoming, at age 77, the oldest human to touch the stars." Obama issued a presidential proclamation on December 9, 2016, ordering the U.S. flag to be flown at half-staff in Glenn's memory. NASA Administrator Charles Bolden said, "Senator Glenn's legacy is one of risk and accomplishment, of history created and duty to the country carried out under great pressure with the whole world watching." Annie Glenn, who was such a huge part of John Glenn's life, outlived him, dying from complications of COVID-19 on May 19, 2020, in a nursing home in St. Paul, Minnesota. She was 100 years old. Like any person, John Glenn did have his flaws, but overall, he was a positive influence on this world, and I think the world was a better place with him in it. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I know not everyone likes the Wholesome Appalachia episodes, and I get it. But a lot of people do listen, and I think it's good to mention good things in Appalachia occasionally. As always, you can follow me on socials under Poison Appalachia. If you can, on the podcast platform you listen to, could you please like and rate me, and please get the word out about this podcast. Thanks. Have a great week.